On this, the July 16th, 2023 edition of What the Ship, we look at the top 5 maritime news stories. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, been a lot going on over the past week. We've got a lot of news to cover. And this week, we're going to do something a little different. I had the staff here at What's Going On with Shipping prepare the top 5 stories for me. So, I'm not exactly sure what order we're going to go in, what the stories are, but I'm going to have them do it because, again, I think spontaneity really makes for a great broadcast. So if you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into our first story. So the first story deals with the issue of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea and the South China Sea. Now, it's kind of funny. There was a story the other week, and I said this on Twitter, that I would never cover this story because it involved the Barbie movie. And so I said never... Okay, talked to the staff, had a quick little meeting, and I think we're back on track. All right, story number 1 deals with the Black Sea. Story number 1 we're going to talk about is 2 elements of what is going on between Russia and Ukraine. The first one is the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The UN is currently awaiting a Russian answer to the Black Sea grain deal as the current deal is set to expire. This Reuters story over in G Captain. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is still awaiting response from the Russian President Putin on a proposal to extend the deal allowing the safe Black Sea export of Ukrainian grain beyond Monday, a UN spokesperson said on Friday. The deal, and this is the tentative aspect of the deal, Guterres wrote to Putin on Tuesday asking him to extend the Black Sea deal in return for connecting a subsidiary of the Russian Agricultural Bank to the international payment system SWIFT. Sources told Reuters. If you remember that one of the things that happened to Putin and Russia was they were cut off from SWIFT, which is this international banking arrangement that really froze Russian assets around the world. It goes on here, the EU is helping the UN and Turkey in a bid to extend this Russian Black Sea grain deal, and the impact it's having is being felt around the world. Black Sea ship disruptions cost crop exporters millions a month as ships are not flowing out of the Black Sea on a regular basis. What does the disruption mean? If Russia does not agree to an extension of the Black Sea deal, what does it mean? Well, a couple of things. Number one, Ukraine could keep shipping grain out of the Black Sea. They can keep having vessels going in. However, it raises the risk that those ships may be targeted, which would increase the war risk insurance, which Ukraine has covered. Ukraine is basically covering war risk for ships coming in, exposes ships to potential attack, and most importantly, the Russians could start attacking those vessels. And what is going to be the response of both Ukraine and the international market and world to that? How do they respond to that? At the same time, if the Russians start attacking Ukrainian grain ships coming out. When I say Ukrainian grain ships, they're carrying Ukrainian grain, but most of them are not Ukrainian vessels. They are ships that are registered in open registries, Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands, you name it, all the big ones, owned by a series of companies. But if the Russians start attacking those vessels, does the Ukrainians start attacking Russian vessels hauling grain, fertilizer, and fuel out of their Black Sea ports? And does the Black Sea then turn into the Persian Gulf of the 1980s? Something I've said repeatedly here. This is the danger we're going to see happen here. So not exactly sure what's going to happen with this on Monday. The other element you have here has to deal with the Russian and the movement of oil. This story from Bloomberg, Russian-linked oil tanker fleet vanishes even faster than it grew. We're seeing a demise of the dark fleet. Splash 24/7 had this great story, the rise and fall of the biggest names associated with the dark fleet. In the game of the tanker whack-a-mole, as port states attempt to crack down on companies hauling Russian oil, some previously fast-growing names are returning to the shadows, while others hoover up tonnage to fill the gap. Mumbai-based Gatic Ship Management, now this is one of the biggest high-profile ones there was, linked to the Russian oil shipments in the wake of the war with Ukraine, has shrunk its fleet from a peak of nearly 50 vessels to just 4 tankers today, according to Equus, which is a shipping database. So we're seeing these ships that had been in the dark fleet, really hiding in the shadows, now coming out in the open. And it's all linked to this story by Greg Miller over at FreightWaves, Russian crude prices have now breached the G7 price cap. Remember, what went into effect in December 5th of last year was tankers were not going to be able to get insurance from mainstream insurers in the West, in Europe, in the United States, in Asia, unless their oil they were carrying was below $60 per barrel, basically this Ural oil. However, what we're seeing now is that price is now up. It's up over 60, and these ships are still hauling oil and getting insurance. And the question really becomes, is there any incentive here for Russia to abide by any of these agreements? Should they do it? They don't seem to be impacted by the Russian oil deal, the price cap. And now, what if they just tell Ukraine, hey, you know what, screw it. We're going to cut you off from the flow of grain in and out of your country. That's going to economically hurt Ukraine, because if they can't get their grain out, that is a good chunk of their GNP, their gross national product, and this is going to hurt them economically, not just militarily, especially when Russia is being prepared for this huge Ukrainian counteroffensive that's supposed to be coming any day now. Story number 2. Great Odin's Raven. Okay. It's funny. First time, very funny. Second time, okay, I got it. Story number 2. The end of the West Coast strike between the Canadian International Longshore and Warehouse Union and the British Columbia Maritime Employers Association is good news. 7,000 workers are back at work. The ports on the west coast of British Columbia are back in operation after 13 days, but I will note that grain, bulk carriers, and passenger vessels were not impacted by this strike because they were either exempted under Canadian law or an agreement was hashed to keep them in. The big issue between these two organizations had to deal with the issue of maintenance of equipment. That would seem to be the real issue because the ILWU does the maintenance on the equipment. Sounds like the BCMEA was farming that out, but now it has been resolved. Of course, there's going to have to be a final resolution to this, but even with the strike being over, we're seeing the impact resonate down the supply chain. This story over here by Lorianne LaRocco over at FreightWaves: impact of Canada's ports strike to be felt for weeks. Extra costs and delays will be part of the U.S. logistics story. Anytime you have a disruption, especially a 13-day disruption, it is going to impact ship schedules. It has a butterfly effect down the entire supply chain. The larger impact, I would argue, is what does this indicate to other unions out there? If Canada's ILWU got what it wanted due to the strike, does this promote the U.S. West Coast IWU in its negotiations with the PMA? Now, they have a tentative agreement. We know that they've gone back to the unions to discuss this, back to the locals, the different ports to discuss it. But if there is a disagreement, will they take to the streets and strike? Because we just saw Canada do that. And again, this is a big resolution. There was a lot of controversy surrounding this. A lot of people came out against the union. A lot of people came out against the BCMEA. But now what we see is the resolution of this strike and work going back on the west coast of Canada, which is huge news. Now we're going to see a movement. I'm still going to be interested to see is how much Canada begins to diversify some of its cargo coming into Vancouver. Does it start using those new ports on the west coast of Mexico, which are now connected to Canada via the Canadian, U.S., Mexican rail line service that just opened up across the middle of the United States? All right, let's try this again. All right, story number 3. I'm serious. No, we are not doing that story. No. Oh, we're back. Sorry about that. Slight technical difficulties. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 3. Story number 3 takes us to the container sector and what is going on with containers around the world. We just talked about the west coast of Canada. Well, let's look at containers. This story by Lodestar over in G-Captain: container freight rates inch upward, but lingering challenges impede full recovery. We knew this was going to be an issue. We're seeing right now a kind of a mixed message coming across on containers. And if you look across the spectrum of stories here, you'll see what I mean. This story from Bloomberg: China's worse than expected exports deal new blow to economy. We're seeing the amount of exports coming out of China decreasing. Now, that's a lagging indication. We're going to see that play out months from now, not right now. Right now, what we're seeing is that uptick in amount of containers coming across the ocean to Europe, to Americas. But right now, we can expect to see that fall. Now, we usually see that in the second half of the year. The second half of the year is always a good indication that we see a decline in the amount of shipping going. However, it may be a more steeper decline than what is expected, especially when you look at stories like this where U.S. container imports pull ahead of 2019 levels. A good sign. We've been talking about this for quite a while, that you got to stop looking at 2020, 2021, 2022 numbers because COVID threw them all off. They were just a mess. And one of the things we've seen is a shift in procurement of goods. There's a lot more e-commerce out there. A lot more people are ordering goods online. We're seeing the shutting down of box stores all around the United States. We're seeing that happen worldwide, which means that this type of commerce will see an uptick. And if the container inputs are up, the amount of imports coming in are up, that's a good indication of that. You have this, the Port of Los Angeles just saw its best month in a year. Now, Port of LA has been really the bellwether that we've used a lot of indications for. We go on here. The Port of LA just saw a movement of 833,035 TEUs in June. Best performance since last July and just 5% less than the last year's monthly record. That is a huge obvious boon for the Port of LA. LA has been struggling to get those numbers up, even though we talk about LA being down. Remember, they're still the largest port in America in terms of container imports coming in. New York, New Jersey is right on their heels. They've already eclipsed Long Beach. But again, the amount of goods coming in, even when the economy downturns, let's think about this for a second. You're going to start changing your buying patterns. You're going to buy, less expensive goods, a lot of, no brand name goods. Well, a lot of that comes from overseas. And that's what we're seeing here. A lot of those staples are coming from overseas. And the Port of LA definitely seems to be manifesting themselves in that area. We're seeing this uptick in the port. It's definitely a big issue. I watched their video here, which basically discusses it, talks about how they've handled that. If you look at their first 6 months of 2023, the port has handled about 4.1 million TEUs. Now, that's a 24% decline compared to that same period in 2022. But again, 2022 was a huge year for them. It was a massive, massive year for them. It's their big year. And if you look at that chart that shows you containers, what happened is at the end of the first half of 2022, it's when it went off the cliff. It just kind of dropped down. The question is, how much does it drop down this year? This is the thing that we're trying to get a gauge on. And if you look at some of those indicators, if you look at the containers coming out of the Far East, out of China, for example, we're seeing those come down. We're seeing that decrease, as that previous story talked about. So we can expect to see that kind of gradual decrease here with importation. The question is then what happens at the beginning of the new year in 2024? How does that kickback after February look? Because that's always the indicator. How much is that hockey stick going to all of a sudden kind of kick back up, and how long does that increase? Big questions to look at here in the container sector. All right, let's go ahead and head over to our fourth story. Don't do it. Don't. Story number 4 deals with a very important issue. It's dealing with the IMO and the issue of greenhouse. Oh, come! I'm done. Sorry, had to have an impromptu staff meeting here at what's going on with shipping. Story number 4 deals with the IMO and issues with their most recent meeting, which is going to really have huge impacts coming forward with shipping. So this story over in G Captain, based on a NOAA report for June 2023, talks about the fact that the world has had the hottest June on record as ocean temperatures soar. So we're seeing this across the world with higher temperatures. I know I can speak about it here in the United States. where we're seeing it. The state of Vermont is underwater. We've had record temperatures across the country. And yes, while temperature is cyclical at many times over the course of world history, I talk about this a lot in my world history classes where we look at temperatures and how they change and cause migration. There are issues that perhaps contribute to it. And one of the things we're talking about here is ocean shipping. Well, we just saw a series of meetings being held by the IMO to revise their greenhouse gases strategy. This story by Barry Parker over at GCAP goes into it, but I want to talk about this one here, which actually kind of breaks it down. This is Mike Schuller's story, where they're talking about it because you get a series of what their message is. So details of the strategy is outlined by IMO. So the first, levels of ambition. So levels of ambition directing the 2023 IMO strategy. Carbon intensity of the ship to decline through further improvement of the energy efficiency for new ships. So again, they're going to take a look at how you can improve energy efficiency. Carbon intensity of international shipping to decline to reduce CO2 emissions per transport work as an average across international shipping by at least 40% by 2030. That's a huge jump. Understand, the goal was to get down to 50% by 2050 under IMO 2020. Now they're talking about getting down to 40% emissions by 2030. Uptake of zero or near zero GHG emission technologies, fuel, or energy sources to increase. So they're talking about increasing the amount to make this go to zero greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping to reach a net zero. This is the most interesting one. To peak greenhouse gas emissions from the international shipping as soon as possible to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by or around close to 2050. And then they have a series of indicative checkpoints. Number one, to reduce total annual greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping by at least 20%, striving for 30% by 2030. To reduce the total greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping by at least 70%, striving for 80% by 2040, and then going to zero by 2050. All right, I have talked about this a lot, and let me be clear about something. I sailed for a long time, and I know what we have done to the world's oceans and the world's atmosphere by shipping. I'm very cognizant of that. I'm also a historian. I know exactly what has happened here. And I understand the striving goal here to get these ships to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. I know how important this is. I really do. But let me be clear. Everybody who went to that meeting flew on a friggin' plane. And planes are the biggest dumpers of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Where is the provisions for that? It's planes, trucks, and cars. I understand that ships emit huge amounts. They're also the most efficient ways to move goods on the friggin' planet, people. And the idea that you're going to make a ship the size of Everalot, 400 meters long, zero gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions is crazy. I mean, it just really is. I don't understand unless you adopt nuclear technology, which is great. I mean, nuclear technology works perfectly for that, especially for a ship that size. But a lot of countries aren't going to take nuclear powered vessels. And until you can get it, plus it's going to be a huge upfront cost. You have to increase labor costs because you're going to need bigger crew. You've got a whole batch of issues associated with nuclear power you've got to get to. These are wildly ambitious goals to have. And to put this on shipping is also another element. Where is the countries developing these technologies? Where is the international push for navies to do this? Because let's be clear, the one group that doesn't fall into this at all is navies. And navies burn a ton of fuel all the time, and they could care less about greenhouse gas emissions. They really can. The U.S. Navy tried to go green on fuel under Secretary of Navy Dalton, and he got killed for that. I mean, just absolutely mauled for that idea. This is a tough prospect. Should we do it? Of course. Yes, we need ambitious goals. We need to strive for these things. But understand, we also need to have realistic goals. And I think pushing from 50% in 2050 to 100% by 2050 is a huge goal. Understand, and by putting these 10-year limits in here, I mean, you're talking about 2030 and 2040. The lifespan of a ship is 20-something years. You've got to set goals that you can meet. You're talking about having to replace all the world's shipping at least twice before 2050 now, and increasing that maybe even more to meet these new goals and standards. you are going to spend so much money building and scrapping vessels and dumping greenhouse gas into the world's atmosphere because of that, then you're going to save by this efficiency. Making it so that when ships come into port, they ship to shore power. Great, fantastic. Stop dumping all these high concentrations of emissions in ports. But understand, that's a huge amount of power you're going to need in ports. LA and Long Beach found this out. Miami has found this out with cruise ships. This is a lot of power you're going to need because ships generate a huge amount of power, especially as ships get bigger and they carry more cargo and have more people on board. I mean, look at the Icon of the Sea, this huge, massive vessel. Oh, and by the way, we just had a ship fire up in Newark, New Jersey, which they finally put out, killed 2 Newark firefighters. Grimaldi, the company that operates and owns that ship, is just purchased 6 new ammonia-fueled vessels. What happens when we start having ammonia fires on board ships? What happens when we have hydrogen fires on board ships as we, hey, we're going to be greenhouse gas efficient? How are we prepared to deal with those issues? There's a lot of implications with this, and I understand the aspiration. The problem is it has to be tempered with practical engineering and practical means of fueling and operating these vessels. You just can't turn off the world trade. And I am worried that the IMO's goals are way too aspirational. Again, I can fix this tomorrow. You want to go green on the ocean? I've got the solution for you. It's called the sailboat. And we're all set to go. We go back to, T-clippers and Baltimore schooners, and we're good to go. The problem is you can't haul 24,000 TEUs on a sailboat. It just can't be done. All right. Gonna try this one last time. I'm gonna go to story number 5. How many people? How many people requested this story? Seriously, how many people requested this story? Seriously, that many? Yeah, but like who? They're probably like bots. No. The head of maritime studies at Tufts University, Sebastian Bruns in Germany, Alison Cusack in Australia. What's wrong with you people? Seriously, what is wrong with you people that you want me to do this story? This story you want me to be my 5th story. I have so many stories to choose from, yet you want me to talk about freaking Barbie. Barbie, that's what we want to talk about? Is that what you want? All right, fine. I'll do it. I'll talk about it. I'm going to talk about story number 5. Vietnam bans the Barbie movie due to an illustration showing China's territorial claim. Yes, that's right. And it even made it over into Maritime Executive, which is going to make a few people I know chuckle very much. This story over in Maritime Executive, Vietnam bans Barbie movie over depiction of the Chinese maritime claims. Can I be clear about this image, number 1? First of all, it's not a real freaking map of the world. It's not a map of the world. It's just some friggin' drawing, some existential drawing that shows, I don't know what it shows. But it's supposed to be this little thing right here. That first of all, it's not even the 9 dash line. It's 8. I counted them. You made me count how many dashes are in the Barbie movie. But what causes this issue here is the popularity of this friggin' movie. I know between this movie and Oppenheimer coming out, we've got the split in the country here. Which movies are going to do better where? But the issue is actually a fairly important one, and I can't believe I'm actually saying this because it's just bothering me to an nth degree to have to say this. But the 9 dash line goes back to China having a territorial claim into the South China Sea. So under what's called the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, this is written back in 1982 and ratified by nearly every nation on the world. There's one big one that didn't ratify it. I'm going to talk about it in a second. But nearly every nation on the planet who's a seafaring nation has ratified UNCLOS. And UNCLOS basically specifies exactly where territorial limits go. And it's 12 miles out. 12 miles out from the ocean, from the shoreline out. And then there's something called the Exclusive Economic Zone, the EEZ, and that goes at least 200 miles out, if not further, because of a continental shelf. And then where there's overlap between the two, part of what UNCLOS did is set out these boundaries between the two. Well, China has a historical claim through what's called the Nine Dash Line. This is what appeared on a map and shows them a territorial claim into the South China Sea. Now, the problem is this is overlapping territorial claims. China has claims there, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, you name it. There's like everyone in the world has competing territorial claims here. At the same time, China has restructured some rocks in the South China Sea into huge military bases. They basically turned what were little shoals and rocks into these islands, which they can project military force from. And this has created a lot of tension in the South China Sea because of the amount of world trade that goes through the South China Sea. Remember, this is China's main access point to Europe, to the Middle East, to oil, you name it. It's a absolutely essential, vital supply line to China. They want this to be a firm, controlled area for them. Now, they're not stopping anybody from sailing in this area. That's not what they're doing. But what they want to do is ensure that nobody else can stop them from sailing. This is China's whole thing with the Belt and Road Initiative, that they really want to ensure that they have secure supply lines for their imports and exports, particularly imports. And Vietnam has reacted to this because Vietnam does not want to stand by any affront by China. Obviously, they have a big issue with China. Everyone for a long time believed Vietnam and China were allies together during the Vietnam War, for example. But then in 1979, they got into a huge war with each other. And China has a big problem with Vietnam for a lot of reasons. Vietnam has been trying to capitalize on China's economic and COVID issues. We've seen Vietnamese trade increase. I think you can expect to see Vietnam start a shipbuilding industry that's going to try to challenge Vietnam, Japan, and Korea. It's very small right now, but it's a potential to come up. And that is what has provoked Vietnam's reaction to anything that gives them this. Because understand, under UNCLOS, this issue went to The Hague. It went to an international court of arbitration where China made a claim on these islands. And under this claim, which was a 2013 case that went back with the Philippines making the case here, The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines. They basically ruled against China. China cannot exert an EEZ and territorial claim based on these rocks that they created into islands. It just doesn't exist. Well, the U.S. has basically said, we acknowledge what The Hague said. The problem with the U.S. stance is this. I have to remove this picture. I'm sorry. I just can't. I can't stand it anymore. The problem with this stance is that the U.S. has never ratified UNCLOS. We are the one big nation that has never ratified the stupid treaty. The treaty for, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is not ratified by the U.S. And I know people are going to scream right now at the TV, well, Sal, the U.S. abides by UNCLOS. It doesn't mean crap if you don't sign the stupid thing and ratify it. And so the U.S. Senate needs to ratify it. They need to ratify it. There's some belief in the heads of the U.S. Senate that if we ratify this, we're giving up our national sovereignty. No, I don't have to say that even better than that. No, you don't. There's no UN maritime police force, as we know, based on the images I bring you about every week. There's nobody out there who's doing this. This is the how do you rule the international waters? And the U.S. abrogating that is a big problem because the irony of all of it is the U.S. doesn't ratify UNCLOS, but we abide by UNCLOS. China ratifies UNCLOS, but they don't abide by it. And so this is what has led to this controversy. And let's be clear, the shipping rights and claims out in the international ocean need to be resolved because you cannot have a lawless sea. I don't care whether it's 5 people diving on Titanic in an unregistered submersible, whether it's illegal and unreported fishing out in the deep oceans that drive Somalia to adopt piracy, or it is the control over the South China Sea and China making claims on territory and lands that belong to Vietnam and the Philippines. We need law on the high seas. We need rules and regulations to govern trade. It's very important because if you allow nationalities to exert control over what is international waters, that's going to be a problem. And that's what the 9-dash line represents, the idea that China can exert political and territorial control over a body of water that is, in all guises, international waterways. It is a big problem. Now, let's be clear. The U.S. has a huge EEZ, largely due to the claims on islands in the Pacific we made when we were a colonial power. I mean, there was something called the Guano Act of 1854, I believe it is, that gave us claims to islands because we were literally hunting bird shit. Guano, sorry. and bringing it back. And that gives us a huge EZ on islands out in the middle of the Pacific, which doesn't make a lot of sense to China because in the 1840s and 50s, China was basically dealing with things like the British and the Opium Wars and being imperialized. And so China feels like, well, they're catching up to the rest of the world in some ways when China had been ahead for a long time. I'm not trying to give excuses to China. I'm just trying to put context here on this issue. And it's a very complex issue. And believe it or not, when Vietnam sits there and says, we're not going to have this movie in there, they are not just doing it for a reason. They believe in their heart that this is being made to placate China, to give in to China. And in many ways, a lot of people feel that giving in to China basically is tacit support to their program, which is a big problem, I have to say. All right, I can't believe you people made me do this story, but I did it. So there you go. Barbie has been on What the Ship. I feel dirty. I feel so dirty. I hope you're all happy. I hope you all had a good, enjoyable laugh over this. If you enjoyed today's video, and I did not at all enjoy today's video, hey, how about subscribing, hitting the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos? Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You can hit the super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a patron of the channel. Till our next episode, this is Sal, thanking everyone and signing off.